There are things a mother notices that she never says out loud. The way her son stops a conversation when she walks into the room. The way her daughter-in-law's eyes move across the furniture when she thinks no one is looking, not the way a guest looks at a room, but the way a person measures what they already consider theirs. The way questions about money get dressed up as questions about health, about comfort, about making things easier for you in your old age, as if old age were a country you'd already arrived in and no longer had the right to govern yourself. I noticed all of it. I had been noticing for 2 years. I said nothing. My name is Eleanor Marsh. I am 71 years old. I spent 35 years as a corporate accountant before I retired, which means I understand, better than most people in my family ever suspected, exactly what a number means and exactly what it hides. I raised one son. I buried one husband. I kept a garden, attended church on Sundays, and made my granddaughter's favorite lemon cake every time she came to visit. To the people who thought they knew me, I was a quiet woman in a comfortable house, a widow living on a modest inheritance, a soft place for the family to land when they needed something. That is what I allowed them to believe. I want to tell you what they did not know. But first, I need you to understand what it felt like to be standing in that hospital corridor on a Tuesday morning in March, wearing a paper gown that opened in the back, waiting to be taken into surgery, when a nurse I had never met pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm, closed my fingers around it, and looked me in the eye with a steadiness that had nothing to do with medical procedure. She did not explain herself. She simply said, "Read it when you have a moment alone." Then she walked away. If this story is already finding its way under your skin, hit that like button and subscribe to Linda's Life Diaries, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the ones who stay quiet longest know the most. Let's see if that's true. I did not read the note immediately. My son Raymond was standing 10 feet away, speaking on his phone in a low, efficient voice, the way he spoke when he believed the conversation was too complex for me to follow. His wife Brenda sat in a chair nearby with her legs crossed and her phone out, not looking at anything in particular but somehow radiating the specific satisfaction of a woman who believes the waiting is almost over. My granddaughter Lily was not there. She was 15, then 16, and Raymond had decided, without asking me, that the hospital was not the right environment for a teenager. What he meant was that Lily asks questions. Lily had always asked questions. When she was 7, she asked me why Daddy talked to Grandpa like Grandpa was a problem to be solved. I had laughed and told her that families were complicated, and she had looked at me with those direct eyes of hers and said, "But you're not complicated, Grandma. You're just you." She had been right, in the way children are right about things before the world teaches them to soften the truth into something polite. I held the note in my fist and smiled at my son when he glanced over. He smiled back. It was a practiced smile, warm and efficient, the smile of a man who has been managing something for long enough that the management feels like love. Let me tell you about Raymond. He was a good boy. I want to say that first, because it is true, and because the truth does not stop being true just because something else is also true. He was a good boy who became a man who learned, somewhere along the way, that being indispensable was the safest place to stand. He was not cruel by nature. He was careful. There is a difference, and it matters, but sometimes careful can look very much like cruel when the person being managed doesn't want to be managed at all. After Gerald died, my husband of 42 years, a man who built furniture by hand in his garage workshop and never once in our marriage made me feel small, Raymond began calling more. Visiting more. Helping more. In the beginning, it felt like grief expressing itself the only way Raymond knew how, through action, through logistics, through the particular comfort of having something to organize. I accepted it. I even appreciated parts of it. Then the questions started. Not cruel questions. Not even suspicious questions on their surface. Just careful, practiced, relentless questions wrapped in the language of concern. "Mom, have you thought about consolidating your accounts? It would be easier to track." "Mom, do you really need both the investment advisor and the financial planner? That seems like it might be redundant." "Mom, if something were to happen, God forbid, would we be able to access things quickly? We just want to make sure everything is organized." Mom, you know you can trust us with this. We just want to help. I listened to every question. I answered some of them. I did not answer all of them. And I noticed what I had always noticed, that Raymond was building a picture, piece by piece, of what he believed my financial life looked like. He was thorough. He was patient. He was, in the way of men who believe they are smarter than the women they love, slightly careless about hiding his thoroughness. He had found the accounts he was looking for. The joint savings Gerald and I held. The house on Birchwood Lane, paid off, appraised at $420,000 by the realtor Raymond himself had suggested. Gerald's pension and the life insurance, which together had put a reasonable cushion into the estate. He had found all of that. He had added it up. He had arrived at a number he believed was the whole picture. He was not wrong about what he had found. He was very wrong about what he had missed. I want to tell you who I was before I was Raymond's mother. Before I was Gerald's wife. Before I was the woman in the paper gown in the hospital corridor with a note folded in her fist. I was Eleanor Marie Calloway before I became Eleanor Marsh. I grew up in a small city in Western Virginia, the second of 4 children born to a father who worked at the post office and a mother who kept meticulous financial records for every household expense in a series of small spiral notebooks that she stored in a shoebox under the kitchen sink. I used to read those notebooks the way some children read comic books. I found them beautiful. Not the amounts, some of them were heartbreaking in their smallness, but the order. The system. The fact that money, which felt like the most chaotic force in the world, could be understood if you were disciplined enough to watch it carefully. I became an accountant because it was the most direct path I could see toward the kind of stability my mother had built in those notebooks but never quite achieved in real life. I was good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that is not about ambition but about a natural alignment between who you are and what you are doing. Numbers made sense to me in the way that language made sense to poets, not just logically, but intuitively, with a kind of emotional recognition. What I did not tell most people, what I had not, by the time I married Gerald, told even Gerald in full, was that I had been investing quietly since I was 24 years old. It started small. Terrifyingly small, in retrospect. A mutual fund account opened in my maiden name with $40 a month redirected from my first real paycheck. Then a second account. Then a small rental property in my late 20s, purchased with a down payment I had saved over 3 years and held in the name of a simple LLC I had incorporated myself one Saturday afternoon in October 1979. Then another property. Then a diversified investment portfolio that I managed the way I managed everything else in my professional life, quietly, methodically, with absolute clarity about where every dollar was going and why. I am not going to tell you the number. Not yet. The number is not the point of the story, and I have found that when people hear a large number too early, they stop listening to everything else. What I will tell you is this: the financial picture Raymond had assembled so carefully over 2 years, the one he was building his plans around, was a fraction of the real picture. A small fraction. The visible edge of something that went much, much deeper. Gerald had known. Partially. He knew I was careful with money, that I had separate accounts I managed myself, that I had been investing since before we met. He had trusted me completely and had the particular wisdom of a man who understood that trust and full disclosure are not the same thing. He used to say, "Ellie, that's your department, and I'm grateful every day that you're the one running it." He said it without irony, without resentment, without the faint competitive anxiety that some men feel around a woman who is more competent in a domain they consider important. Gerald was not those men. He was himself, which was a great deal better. Raymond had Gerald's steady nature but not his ease. Raymond needed to understand things so he could control them, and what he could not understand he became anxious about, and what he was anxious about he managed, and what he managed he gradually began to believe was his. That is the story, really. That is the whole story, compressed into one sentence. But I promised to tell it properly. So I will go back. 2 years after Gerald died, Raymond and Brenda began spending more time in my home. Not moving in, nothing as direct or honest as that. Just visiting more frequently. Staying longer. Finding reasons to remain. Brenda had opinions about the kitchen, the lighting was insufficient, the countertops were dated, the pantry arrangement was inefficient. She shared these opinions the way people share observations about the weather, not as criticisms but as facts that exist independently of anyone's feelings. I listened. I did not change my kitchen. She began leaving things there. A coffee maker she preferred. A set of kitchen towels in a different pattern than mine. A dish rack that replaced the one I had used for 20 years. The first time I mentioned it, gently, she looked at me with an expression of gentle surprise and said, "Mom, I just thought it would be more practical." She had begun calling me Mom roughly 8 months after the wedding and had never stopped, with a particular ease that I had always found unsettling without being able to articulate why. Raymond began attending my medical appointments. This was the thing that should have alarmed me most, and which I allowed because I was adjusting to being alone, because the appointments in the first year after Gerald's death were strange and uncertain territory, because it is genuinely easier to have someone else drive you to a cardiology consultation when your hands are still not quite steady and the waiting room feels very large for one person. I let Raymond attend. I let him speak to the doctors. I watched him listen to what they said with the intense concentration of a man filing information away. By the time I understood what he was filing it for, we had arrived at the Tuesday in March with the paper gown and the corridor and the surgery I needed because my heart's left valve had decided, in the particular way of organs that have worked faithfully for 7 decades, that it was ready to be taken seriously. I had been diagnosed 8 months earlier. A routine echocardiogram, the kind your doctor orders not because she suspects something but because you are 71 and have a family history and she is thorough, had revealed the kind of narrowing that does not announce itself dramatically but does eventually require attention. My cardiologist, Dr. Amara Osei, a small woman with a very direct manner and extremely calm hands, explained my options with the patience of someone who understood that patients needed to sit with difficult news before they could receive practical information. Raymond came to that appointment. I had asked Lily to come as well, because she was staying with me for the summer and because I wanted someone in the room who would not flinch, who would listen without immediately pivoting to problem-solving mode. Lily sat beside me and held my hand throughout. Raymond took notes on his phone. Dr. Osei explained that surgery was the most effective option, that my overall health made me a strong candidate, and that the timing, while not immediately urgent, should not be deferred past the end of the year. She recommended a surgical team and a hospital and gave us a referral packet. On the drive home, Raymond was already on the phone with the hospital's scheduling department. Lily looked out the window. At a red light, she reached over and took my hand again without saying anything. I squeezed it once. She squeezed back. That evening, after Raymond and Brenda had gone to the hotel where they were staying, they were visiting for the week, ostensibly to be there for me. During the appointment, though I had not asked them to come, Lily sat with me on the back porch while the sun went down over the garden, and she said what she had been turning over in her mind all afternoon. "Grandma, why does Dad need to know about all your accounts?" I looked at her. She was 15 then, with my mother's sharp eyes and Gerald's patient mouth, and she was looking at me with the particular focus of someone who had been watching something develop for long enough to feel certain it required naming. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He was asking Dr. Osei about power of attorney. He asked about it twice. Like he'd looked up the question ahead of time. She paused. "And last month when I was staying here, he was in your office when he didn't know I was home. He said he was looking for the insurance folder but he was on the phone with someone. I didn't hear everything, but he said something about, once we have a clearer picture of the full estate." I did not react outwardly. I was very practiced at not reacting outwardly. I told her I would look into it. I told her she was a sharp girl and her grandfather would have been proud of her. I told her not to worry. I did not tell her that I had been watching the same thing she was watching, from the inside, for 18 months. I did not tell her that I already understood exactly what Raymond was looking for. I did not tell her that the reason he had not found it, the reason he would not find it without my help, was that he was looking for Eleanor Marsh's financial life, and significant portions of Eleanor Marsh's financial life were legally, quietly, and completely organized under a name he had never thought to search. Eleanor Calloway. My mother's name for me, the name that had been on my first bank account and my first investment account and the LLC I had opened in 1979 and the 43 years of careful, invisible work that had accumulated in the space between who the world thought I was and who I actually was. I had not hidden any of it. It was not hidden. It was documented, legal, and entirely mine. I had simply never seen a reason to announce it to people who had not yet demonstrated they could be trusted with it. That calculation, as I sat on my porch in the failing light with Lily beside me, was beginning to feel less like privacy and more like protection. The surgery was scheduled for March 14th. The month between Lily's question and the operating table was a quiet month in the way that certain kinds of weather are quiet, still on the surface, with something building underneath that you can feel in your joints before you can name it. Raymond and Brenda came to stay with me for the 2 weeks leading up to the procedure. Raymond said it was to help me prepare. He drove me to the preoperative appointments. He sat with me through the consultations with the surgical team. He was attentive and efficient and occasionally kind, and I watched him the way I had always watched things I needed to understand fully, without expression, without comment, with absolute attention. He made 2 phone calls during that period that I was not meant to hear. The first was in the kitchen, early one morning when he believed I was still in bed. I was not still in bed. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen door, having gone to get water, and I stood very still in the way you learn to stand still when you have spent a lifetime noticing things that other people prefer you not to notice. He was speaking to someone about documents. About timing. About the hospital being an opportunity because the pre-anesthesia period was a window, he said. A window during which a person could sign things they might not sign when they were fully alert, and during which the signing could be characterized as routine medical preparation. He said he had already spoken to a notary who was willing to come to the hospital. I stood in the hallway. I did not move. The second call was 3 days later, to someone he called a financial advisor, a man whose name I caught as a first name only, Marcus, and with whom Raymond discussed the mechanics of a durable power of attorney and what it would allow him to access once it was in effect. He said he believed my total assets were in a manageable range. He said it twice, manageable. I found that interesting. I found it very interesting indeed. I went back to bed after the first call. I lay in the dark in the house where Gerald and I had lived for 31 years, and I felt the particular clarity that arrives when you have been watching something develop for a long time and have finally seen it whole. I was not afraid. Fear had not been my primary response in a very long time. What I felt was something closer to resolution, the feeling of a decision that has been forming for months finally settling into its final shape. I thought about what I needed to do and in what order. I did not call Raymond. I did not confront him. I did not change my behavior in any way that would signal I knew what was happening. I called my attorney on a Tuesday morning while Raymond and Brenda were out buying groceries, using the landline in my bedroom, speaking quietly and specifically and for exactly 12 minutes. My attorney, a woman named Catherine Paulides whom I had worked with for 16 years, listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds, and then she said, "Eleanor, I'll have everything we need in place by Friday. Don't sign anything before you call me. Not one thing." "I know," I said. "And if they try anything at the hospital?" "I'll handle it," I said. "I just wanted you to know what was coming." She said she would send a letter to the hospital's legal department on Thursday. I thanked her and hung up and went downstairs and started a pot of coffee and was standing at the kitchen window looking at the garden when Raymond and Brenda came through the door with the groceries, already talking about what I should and shouldn't eat in the week before the procedure. I turned and smiled at my son. He smiled back. Neither smile reached anywhere near the eyes. The morning of the surgery was gray and cold, the particular flat gray of March in our part of the country, the color of something that has not yet decided what it wants to become. I dressed carefully. I ate a small breakfast the night before and nothing that morning, as instructed. I sat in Gerald's chair for a few minutes with my coffee, a habit I had kept since he died, not because it made me feel closer to him but because it reminded me of what it felt like to sit quietly in a room with someone who required nothing from you. Raymond drove. Brenda sat in the back seat going through something on her phone. I watched the city pass the window and thought about the note in my coat pocket, not the one the nurse would give me, which I did not yet know was coming, but the one I had written to myself and sealed and left in the fireproof box in my closet under a folder labeled clearly, in my handwriting, for Catherine Paulides. At the hospital, the check-in was routine. The nurses were competent and warm. The preoperative intake nurse, a woman named Patricia Chen, was efficient and precise in the way of very good medical professionals, asking her questions without rushing them and writing down the answers with the slightly old-fashioned preference for paper that I have always found reassuring in nurses. She asked if I had any questions or concerns. I said I had none. She moved on. Raymond was attentive throughout. He spoke to the nurses in the careful tone of a man who wants to be perceived as cooperative but is also, underneath it, managing the room. He had a folder with him. I had seen it in the kitchen that morning before we left, and I had noted its thickness, and I had said nothing about it. Brenda had stayed in the waiting room. Not really my thing, she had said, with the light dismissiveness she applied to anything that made her feel uncomfortable, and I had been briefly grateful that one of them, at least, preferred to be absent. The surgical team came to do their final preoperative checks. There was a brief, busy period during which Raymond stepped to one side to take a phone call and the nurses moved in their efficient, organized way around me, and it was during that period, during those few minutes when Raymond's back was turned and the room was full of the particular purposeful noise of medical preparation, that Patricia Chen appeared at my left side, close enough to speak quietly, and pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and in that moment I felt the particular recognition of one careful woman meeting another, the recognition of someone who has spent years watching things and noticing things and deciding precisely when to act on what she has noticed. "Read it when you have a moment alone," she said. Then she stepped away and was immediately part of the organized movement of the room, and no one would have known anything had passed between us. I closed my fingers around the note. I held it through the rest of the preoperative checks. I held it when Raymond came back from his phone call and resumed his careful attendance. I held it when the anesthesiologist came and introduced himself and explained what would happen. I held it when the orderly arrived with the gurney to take me to the surgical suite, and Raymond stepped forward with his folder and said, "Actually, before she goes, there are just a few documents." And the anesthesiologist said, pleasantly and firmly, that any paperwork would need to wait until after the procedure and the recovery period, that his patient needed to stay calm and focused, and that there would be plenty of time for administrative matters afterward. Raymond's face did something brief and controlled that I noted and filed. The orderly wheeled me away. Raymond walked alongside for the first stretch of the corridor, and then the doors closed between us, and I was alone on the other side of them with the paper in my hand and the particular silence that arrives just before something irrevocable begins. I unfolded the note. Patricia Chen had small, precise handwriting. 7 lines. No preamble. No apology. Just the facts, laid out with the directness of a woman who had learned to communicate important things in the limited time available to her. "The man with you brought documents for you to sign. I saw them when he set down his folder, medical POA, and a financial authorization. These are not hospital forms. We don't bring those to pre-op, someone else's name is on the filing stamp, not ours. I've seen this before. Family members bringing their own paperwork to the hospital, using the pre-sedation window. Please do not sign anything before you speak to your own attorney. Not as a formality. Because I think you need to. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry for the alarm. If I'm right, take care of yourself. P. Chen." I read it twice. Then I folded it and held it against my chest and looked at the ceiling of the corridor moving past overhead, the institutional lights, the regular seams in the tiles, the particular geometry of a place built for emergencies. I was not surprised. That was the thing I want you to understand. I was not surprised. I had known, or suspected enough of it to amount to knowing, for months. What the note did was not reveal something new. It confirmed something old. And confirmation, when you have been waiting for it in the particular patient way that I had been waiting, is not alarming. It is clarifying. I closed my eyes. I thought of Gerald. I thought of Lily. I thought of the folder in the fireproof box and the phone call I had made on a Tuesday morning to Catherine Paulides and the quiet machinery I had set in motion in the weeks before this day. The machinery that Raymond did not know existed because he had spent 2 years building a picture of me that left out everything that would have changed the picture entirely. The surgery went without complication. I was under for 4 hours. I woke in recovery with my chest sore and my mind cleaner than it had felt in a long time, the particular mental clarity that sometimes follows the removal of something that has been causing pressure, and I thought, now we begin. I asked the recovery nurse if Patricia Chin was on shift. The nurse checked and said she wasn't certain, would look into it. I asked her to pass along a message if she saw her, thank you. I was right to read it. Then I asked for a phone. I called Catherine Paulides. She answered on the first ring. Eleanor, she said. How are you feeling? Clearer than I've felt in some time, I said. Tell me what happened on your end. The hospital's legal department received my letter Thursday morning, she said. I understand your son attempted to have documents notarized in pre-op and was redirected by both the anesthesiologist and the attending nurse. He's in the waiting room. A pause. He's been there for 4 hours. Brenda left about an hour in. I almost smiled. Good, I said. There are some things he and I need to discuss. But not today. When? When I'm ready, I said. When everything I need in place is in place. Another pause. Catherine, there are some additional documents I'd like to prepare. We've discussed most of them. But I want to add something. What? I'd like to revise the trust structure. Specifically, the beneficiary designations. I shifted slightly against the pillow, feeling the careful ache of healing beginning its long work. I've been thinking about what I want the next part of this to look like. And I think it's time to stop allowing other people to imagine it for me. There was a brief, warm silence from Catherine Paulides. I'll have the first drafts to you by the end of the week, she said. Raymond came into my recovery room at 3 in the afternoon. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing anxiety for hours, the particular exhaustion of a plan that has run into friction it did not account for. Brenda was not with him. I was glad of that. What I needed to say to Raymond, what I was going to say to Raymond, in time, was between the two of us, and it deserved the particular intimacy of a mother and son in a room with no witnesses. But not today. Today he came in and sat in the chair beside my bed and looked at me with an expression that contained, in layers I could see clearly, relief and frustration and the particular recalculation of a man who has had to abandon one plan and has not yet settled on what comes next. Mom, he said. How are you feeling? Tired, I said. But well. I looked at him for a moment. Thank you for being here. Something crossed his face that I could not quite name. Some version of shame, perhaps, or something adjacent to it. Not the full thing, Raymond had not arrived at the full thing yet. But a shadow of it. A signal that somewhere underneath the careful management and the practiced concern, there was still the boy I had rocked to sleep, still the person who could feel the gap between what he was doing and what he knew was right. That boy was still in there. I had not given up on that boy. But I also had not forgotten what he had planned to do in my hospital corridor with a folder and a notary and the particular convenience of a woman who couldn't yet argue back. You need some rest, Raymond said. I do, I agreed. We can talk when you're stronger. We can, I said. We'll have a great deal to talk about. He nodded. He did not quite meet my eyes. He stayed for an hour, and then he left, and I lay in the white room with the sounds of the hospital moving quietly around me, and I thought about what comes next, and what comes after that, and the long patient careful work of making sure that the people who had spent 2 years building a picture of me would finally have to look at the whole painting. They were not going to like what they saw. But that, I had decided, was no longer my responsibility to manage. Recovery is a particular kind of time. Not the dramatic kind that appears in films, all sudden clarity and tearful bedside reconciliations. The real kind is slower and less cinematic. It is days that feel identical to each other, measured in the gradual reduction of pain and the gradual return of appetite and the particular boredom of a body that is doing important work invisibly while the person inside it waits. It is waking at 3 in the morning and lying in the dark and thinking thoughts you have been too busy, for too long, to sit with properly. I thought about Raymond. I thought about the years of it, not just the 2 years of careful questioning and financial inventory, but the longer arc before that, the accumulation of small things that I had noticed and absorbed and filed without examining them too closely because I loved my son and because love, in my experience, tends to cause a particular form of selective attention. We see what we need to see. We decline to examine what examining might cost us. I had done this too, in my way. I was not without responsibility for the gap that had opened between who Raymond was becoming and who I had allowed myself to believe he still was. But I was done declining to examine. Raymond's plan, as I assembled it from what I had overheard and what Catherine Paulides had gathered through her own careful channels, was not complicated. Complicated plans tend to fail. Raymond was an intelligent man, and intelligent men, in my experience, prefer plans that are simple and legal and difficult to object to once they are in motion. The hospital documents were the first step, a durable power of attorney, broad enough to cover financial decisions as well as medical ones, obtained while I was pre-sedated and presented to me as administrative routine. Raymond had, I later learned, researched the preoperative window for several months. He had consulted with a man named Dennis Farrell, a financial advisor who worked, Catherine confirmed through a colleague, primarily with estate transitions and had a particular specialty in what he called family wealth consolidation. I found that phrase interesting. Consolidation suggests that the wealth exists in scattered form, waiting to be gathered. It is the language of someone who has already decided the gathering is legitimate. The power of attorney, once signed, would have given Raymond authority over my accounts, the ones he knew about. He intended, Catherine told me, to move the liquid assets into a joint management structure that would require his signature alongside mine, which in practical terms means a structure that requires his signature instead of mine, since a 71-year-old recovering from cardiac surgery is not typically in a position to push back against efficient financial management performed by her devoted son who only wants to help. The house would follow. A property transfer document had been prepared, naming Raymond and Brenda as co-owners, presented as an estate planning measure, simpler that way, he had explained to Dennis Farrell, avoids probate, saves the family time. What it would have avoided, in practice, was the possibility of my changing my mind. I want to be clear about something. Raymond had not considered, in any version of this plan that I could reconstruct, what would happen to me. Not in the way you consider a person, their comfort, their preferences, their need for the particular security that comes from knowing your own house is your own house. He had considered my welfare as a line item. He had built in what he thought was a generous provision. I would remain in the house, of course, as long as I wanted to live there. He would manage the finances. He would make sure everything was handled. He would take care of everything. That is the thing about people who want to take care of everything. They never ask whether the person they are taking care of wants to be taken care of. They mistake the desire to manage for the act of love. They perform care with the genuine conviction that performance and substance are the same, because they have never had to feel the difference between being looked after and being looked at, between someone managing your life for your benefit and someone managing your life for their own peace of mind. Gerald had looked at me. 42 years, and he had seen me. Not the version of me that was useful to him, not the version that confirmed what he already believed about the world, but me, the whole stubborn complicated accountant who kept her own books and her own counsel and made her own decisions. He had loved that woman without needing her to be simpler. Raymond had always found her slightly inconvenient. Catherine Paulides came to the house on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the surgery. She brought 2 colleagues, a junior partner named Stephen and a paralegal named Grace who had worked with Catherine's firm for 11 years and had the kind of comprehensive memory for legal detail that I had always found deeply reassuring. They set up at the dining room table while Raymond was at his hotel. He had extended his stay, nominally to help with my recovery, practically to remain close to what he believed was about to become available to him. We worked for 4 hours. The existing documents were not wrong, exactly. They simply reflected a version of my life that was incomplete. The trust had been structured correctly but had gaps I now wanted to close. The beneficiary designations on the investment accounts, the ones Raymond did not know existed, needed to be updated to reflect what I had decided about the shape of things going forward. The foundation, which I will explain in a moment, needed to be formalized. I had made the decisions over the 3 weeks of recovery. I had lain in bed and thought them through with the same methodical patience I had applied to every financial decision since I was 24 years old. I had not rushed. I had not acted from anger, though I had felt anger, or from the particular wounded pride of a woman who has been underestimated by someone she raised. I had acted from clarity. Here is what I had built, in the 43 years since I opened that first account with $40 a month. The LLC incorporated in 1979, Eleanor Callaway Holdings, registered initially in Virginia and later moved to Delaware when Delaware's business laws became more favorable, had acquired, over 4 decades, 7 residential rental properties in 3 states. All were managed by a property management company retained directly by the LLC. All generated regular income. All had appreciated in the particular reliable way of properties in cities that grew because they were good places to live and not because someone decided they were fashionable. The investment portfolio, managed separately through a brokerage account in my maiden name, had been built over the same period with the same patient discipline. Index funds, mostly, with a portion in dividend-generating equities I had selected myself, and a smaller portion in bonds held for stability. I had never tried to be clever with it. I had simply let time do what time does with money that is left alone and tended carefully. The house on Birchwood Lane, which Raymond had appraised and was planning to consolidate, was, in fact, held in trust, a trust one had established in 2003, when Gerald was still alive and we had discussed, quietly and thoroughly, what we wanted the future to look like. The trust named me as the sole trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. Raymond was listed as a conditional remainder beneficiary, subject to conditions he did not know existed, which I had written into the document 16 years before he began his campaign to obtain what he believed would one day be his. The conditions, if I chose to enforce them, were simple. Behavioral. The kind of conditions a careful woman writes into a document when she loves her son but has been paying attention to who he is becoming. And then there was the foundation. Gerald and I had talked about it for years, something that would outlast us, something that used what we had built to do something useful. I had begun the formal structure 3 years before he died and had, since his death, been quietly adding to it. A charitable foundation in Gerald's name, established to fund vocational education programs for first-generation college students in the region where he had grown up. It was not enormous. It was not meant to be enormous. It was meant to be lasting, which is different. Raymond did not know about the foundation. He did not know about the LLC. He did not know about the brokerage account in my maiden name, the 7 rental properties, or the investment portfolio. He knew about the joint savings account, the life insurance, Gerald's pension, and the house. He had built his entire plan around a fraction of the whole. Catherine looked at me across the dining room table when we had finished the final document, and she said, in the dry way of a woman who has seen a great many estates and a great many families and has learned to find the human story within the legal architecture, Eleanor, do you want to know what I think? Tell me, I said. I think your son is going to have a very interesting few weeks. I thought about Raymond in that corridor with his folder. I thought about the notary he had arranged. I thought about Dennis Farrell and his language about consolidation and manageable ranges. Yes, I said. I think he is. The weeks after the paperwork were quiet ones. Necessary quiet, the kind that has work in it. I healed. My chest stopped hurting in the acute way and began hurting in the duller, deeper way of tissue that is rebuilding, which my surgeon had told me to expect and which I found, after the first week, almost companionable. Pain that is healing is a different thing from pain that is damage. I had spent enough of my professional life distinguishing between numbers that were problems and numbers that were simply information. The principle applied more broadly than accounting. Raymond came by every day. He was helpful in the practical ways, driving me to follow-up appointments, managing the groceries, handling the things that required more physical capacity than I currently had. I accepted his help without warmth or coldness. I was pleasant. I was precise. I said what was necessary and nothing beyond it. He was watching me, I knew, for signs of what he considered weakness. The post-surgical vulnerability that would make the conversation he was planning easier to have. He was also, I could see in the subtle adjustments of his approach, recalibrating. The hospital plan had failed. He needed another angle. He was patient in the way of people who believe they are simply waiting for the right moment, not understanding that moments can be managed just as carefully by the person they are waiting on as by the person waiting. Brenda had extended her stay as well. She had reorganized my pantry while I was resting one afternoon, without asking. She mentioned, twice in 1 week, that a single-story property might be easier for me at this stage of life. She said it the way she said everything, as an observation, as a fact, as a courtesy to me that involved pointing out my own limitations before I could get confused about whether I had any. I thanked her for both observations. I did not move into a single-story property. I put my pantry back. Lily came to stay 2 weeks after the surgery, having finished the semester at her school with the particular urgency of a teenager who has been waiting for permission to be somewhere she needs to be. She arrived at the front door with a duffel bag and a backpack and a container of lemon curd she had made herself using my recipe, and she looked at me for 3 full seconds in the doorway before she said anything. "You look okay," she said finally. "I am okay," I said. "Better than okay?" "Getting there," I said. "Come in." She set her bag down and hugged me with the careful, precise tenderness of someone who has been told not to squeeze too hard and is concentrating very hard on the instruction. I held her. She smelled like the lemon curd and something floral and the particular combination that is just Lily, the smell that has been Lily since she was small enough to fit in the crook of one arm. "Dad's here," she said quietly, when she pulled back. "He's coming for dinner," I said. "Are you all right with that?" She considered it. Lily always considered things before she answered, which had been, since she was very young, both her most useful trait and the one that made Raymond most impatient. He found considered answers slow. He preferred quick answers, the kind that confirmed what he already believed. "I'm all right with it," she said. I want to talk to you first. Before dinner." "I know," I said. "Come sit." We sat on the back porch in the weak spring sun, and I let Lily tell me what she had been carrying since the day of the appointment with Dr. Osei, since the summer she had stayed with me and overheard the phone call from the hallway, since all the months of watching the same thing I was watching and not knowing what to do with what she saw. She told me about the second call she had overheard, different from the one she had told me about before. This one had been in October, she said, when she was visiting for her fall break and Raymond had not realized she was in the house. She had been in the upstairs guest room reading when she heard his voice carry up the stairwell with the particular acoustics of that house, the way sound traveled in certain directions if you were in the right place. He had been talking to someone named Marcus. She had heard that name. And she had heard him say that once the surgery happened and the recovery period began, the process would be easier to manage because my attention would be on getting well and not on watching what he was doing. She told me this with a steadiness that I recognized. It was my mother's steadiness, the steadiness of someone who has learned to hold difficult information without breaking it or being broken by it. I had not taught her that directly. Some things are passed through blood and example before they are ever put into words. When she finished, she looked at me and waited. "Lily," I said, "I need to tell you some things. And I need you to listen to all of them before you react." She nodded once. I told her about Patricia Chan and the note. I told her about the documents Raymond had brought to the hospital. I told her about the conversation I had with Catherine Paulides from my recovery room. I did not tell her the numbers were not, as I had told myself from the beginning, the point of the story. But I told her enough of the shape of things that she understood that her grandmother had not been caught unaware, had not been a woman at the mercy of events, had been, instead, a woman who had been watching and planning and had simply been waiting for the moment to move. Her face during this was extraordinary. I watched the understanding move through it, watched the alarm and then the confusion and then, gradually, as I continued, something that looked like relief, the particular relief of someone who has been worrying about a person they love and has just been informed that the person has been, in fact, fine. Not unchanged. Not unaffected. But fine. Themselves. Intact. He doesn't know, she said, when I finished. He knows what I allowed him to know, I said. Which is quite a bit less than the whole picture. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness that had always been her clearest quality, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to let things unfold as they need to unfold," I said. There are some conversations that can only happen once certain things are already in motion. And some things are already in motion. Like what? Like the fact, I said, that Raymond is about to try to have a conversation with me about my finances, and that conversation is going to be based on an understanding of my finances that is quite substantially incorrect. A pause. Then Lily said, "How incorrect?" I looked at her. She held my gaze with those clear direct eyes. Significantly, I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, Lily was too serious for this to be funny yet. But the beginning of something. The recognition of a story that was going to turn out differently than the person telling it expected. "Grandma," she said slowly, "have you been a secret this whole time?" I thought about that. I thought about Eleanor Calloway and 43 years of quiet careful work and the folders in the fireproof box and the LLC and the foundation in Gerald's name and all the invisible architecture of a life built by a woman who had understood, from the very beginning, that the most powerful position available to her was the one where no one thought to look. "Not a secret," I said. "Just private." Raymond came for dinner at 6. He was, as always, efficient about it, arriving on time, bringing wine he knew I liked, kissing my cheek with the practiced warmth of a son who has persuaded himself that the warmth is genuine. Brenda was with him, pleasant and slightly watchful, her eyes moving across the room in the familiar way that I had long since stopped finding subtle. Lily sat across from them at the dinner table. She had offered to help me cook, and we had made a simple meal together in the kitchen that afternoon, moving around each other with the ease of two people who have cooked together for years. She had not talked about Raymond during the cooking. She had talked about school, about a teacher she admired, about a book she was reading. She had been, I noticed, working very hard at being ordinary, and she was very good at it, and I was grateful. At the table, Raymond was his most attentive. He asked about my recovery. He asked about the follow-up appointment scheduled for the following week. He commented on the food with genuine pleasure. Raymond had always had good taste, and poured wine for himself and Brenda with the ease of someone making himself at home. I watched him over the rim of my water glass. He was waiting for something. I could see it in the slight tension at his jaw, the way his attention kept sliding toward me and then correcting itself, the way he was managing the conversation with just a fraction too much care. He was waiting for a moment. An opening. He had prepared something to say, and he was looking for where to put it. He found it at dessert. "Mom," he said, in the voice he used when he had decided to be direct, which was still not entirely direct, but was closer to it than his usual register. "I know this isn't the best time, with you still recovering. But I've been thinking about what happens after. Long term. And I think we need to have a real conversation about your finances." Brenda was very still. Lily was looking at her plate. I set down my fork. I looked at Raymond. "All right," I said. He blinked. He had expected, I could see, some form of gentle resistance, not refusal. Raymond had never expected outright refusal, but the usual soft redirection, "Oh, we don't need to talk about that now, let's just enjoy dinner." He had not expected simple agreement. "All right," he repeated. "Have the conversation," I said. "I'm listening." He recalibrated quickly, which was one of the things I had always genuinely admired about Raymond. He was adaptable. He said, "I've been concerned about your overall financial structure. I know you've been managing things yourself, but at this point, a careful pause, given your health situation, and given that Gerald is gone and you're on your own, it might make sense to simplify. To consolidate. To make sure everything is in a form that can be managed more easily. Managed more easily. There was that word again. What would consolidation look like, I said, in practical terms. He was pleased by the question. It meant I was engaging, which he read as pliability. A durable power of attorney would be the first step, he said. Just as a practical measure, if you were ever in a situation where you couldn't manage things yourself, we'd want to make sure there was someone who could step in quickly. And then we could look at the accounts, simplifying those, maybe moving them into a single structure that we manage together. Together, I said. Together, he confirmed. With my name on the accounts as well. For simplicity. I nodded slowly, as if considering this. As if it were new information. As if I had not spent 3 weeks after surgery in conversation with Catherine Paulides, re-architecting every document that governed my financial life so that it would be, by the time this conversation arrived, impossible to access without my specific, informed, uncoerced consent. I appreciate that you're thinking about this, I said. I'll tell you what, I want to look at some things with my attorney before we formalize anything. Would that be all right? He hesitated. Just for a moment. Of course, he said. Of course, that makes total sense. There's no rush. There's no rush, said the man who had arranged a notary for my preoperative window. Good, I said. I'll set something up this week. I picked up my fork and returned to my dessert. After a moment, the conversation moved on to other things. Brenda asked about the garden. Raymond talked about work. Lily, across the table, raised her eyes to mine for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw something I had not seen on her face in years. Relief. Clean and simple and complete. I gave her the smallest possible nod. She looked back at her plate. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Linda's Life Diaries. The best ones are still coming, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear them. After dinner, Raymond and Brenda left. Lily and I washed the dishes together in the easy silence of people who are comfortable with each other, and when the kitchen was clean she said, without looking up from the dish she was drying, he has no idea, does he? No, I said. And you're going to let him keep not having any idea? For a little while longer, I said. There are some things that need to happen in a particular order. What happens after the order? Then he finds out. She was quiet for a moment. Is it going to be bad? For him. I thought about that carefully. I had thought about it carefully for weeks. There is a version of this kind of story where the answer is yes, where what the family member loses is everything, where the reckoning is total and the consequences are absolute. I had asked myself whether I wanted that version. I did not. Not because Raymond did not deserve consequences for what he had attempted. He did. The consequences I had in mind were real and earned, and would alter significantly the landscape he had been imagining as his own. But I was not interested in destruction. I was interested in clarity. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters. Some things he was planning on will not be available to him, I said. He will have to adjust his understanding of what is his and what isn't. And the rest? The rest, I said, is between me and my son. And it's a conversation that I intend to have on my terms, when I am ready, and not one moment before. Lily put away the last dish. She turned and looked at me with those direct, clear eyes. Grandma, she said, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest. Always, I said. Are you all right? Not about the plan, or the documents, or any of that. You. Are you all right? I held her gaze. I thought about Gerald in his workshop chair with sawdust on his hands, about the Tuesday morning phone call to Catherine Paulides, about Patricia Chen's precise handwriting on a folded piece of paper pressed into my palm in a hospital corridor. About the note itself, the 7 careful lines of a woman who had seen something and decided, in the limited time available to her, to say so. I thought about what it meant to be 71 years old and recovering from surgery and standing in my kitchen with my granddaughter who had been watching, for months, with her grandfather's eyes. I am more than all right, I said. I am exactly where I need to be. 3 weeks after dinner, Raymond called to say he had set up a meeting with a financial advisor and hoped I would be open to speaking with him together. He said it carefully, offering it as a helpful suggestion from a devoted son, using the language of assistance and simplicity that he had been using for 2 years. I told him that sounded fine, but that I had already scheduled a meeting with my own attorney for the following Tuesday, and I hoped we could coordinate from there. A brief silence. Then, of course. Of course, whatever you're comfortable with. Actually, I said, I'd like you to come to Tuesday's meeting. With me and Catherine. I think it would be helpful for you to have a fuller picture of things. Another silence. Longer this time. A fuller picture, he repeated. There are some things about the estate structure, I said, that I realize you may not be aware of. It would probably be useful to have that information. The silence stretched. Okay, he said finally. I can do Tuesday. I thanked him and said, goodbye, and set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment in the quiet of the house that was mine, in the warm spring afternoon light, listening to the particular ordinary sounds of a life that was entirely, completely, unreservedly my own. Then I went to the garden. The lavender I had planted the previous fall along the back fence was beginning to come up, pale and tentative and very much alive, reaching for the light with the patient certainty of things that have been planted correctly and given time. I thought about Tuesday. I thought about Raymond sitting across from Catherine Paulides, across from Grace with her comprehensive memory and Stephen with his careful notes, across from all the documentation of the life Raymond had not known his mother had been living for 43 quiet years. I thought about the moment, and there would be a specific moment, I knew, because there always was, when he would understand that the picture he had been building for 2 years, the picture he had based his entire plan upon, was a small and partial thing, a corner of a canvas that went far beyond what he had ever thought to look for. I thought about what his face would do in that moment. And I felt, quietly and without any particular drama, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and knows, with the certainty of someone who has planned carefully and waited well, that the moment she has been waiting for is almost here. Almost. Tuesday arrived the way important days tend to arrive, quietly, without announcement, indistinguishable from any other morning until you are inside it and the particular weight of it settles around you. I woke at 5:30. I made coffee the way I had made it every morning for 40 years, 2 scoops, a splash of cream, no sugar, the same proportions I had used when Gerald was alive and the kitchen held 2 people instead of 1. I stood at the window and watched the garden come visible as the light strengthened, the lavender along the back fence showing its pale early growth, the roses I had put in last fall beginning to show the first tight buds of the season. I thought about what I was going to do in Catherine's office in 4 hours, and I felt ready. Not anxious. Not triumphant. Ready, in the way of someone who has done the necessary preparation and is simply waiting for the work to begin. Lily came downstairs at 7. She had stayed through the weekend, returning to school the following day, and she had spent those extra days close to me in the particular way of someone who wants to be present for something without quite knowing how to ask for permission to be present. I had not sent her away. I had let her stay, and we had spent the weekend in the ordinary companionship of 2 people who are comfortable with each other, cooking, reading, walking in the garden, talking about things that had nothing to do with Raymond or Tuesday or the meeting that was coming. She poured herself coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked at me for a moment. Today, she said. Today, I agreed. Are you nervous? No, I said. And it was true. The time for nervousness had been months ago, in the corridor outside the kitchen while I listened to my son speak about windows and opportunities and manageable ranges. The time for nervousness had been the night after the surgery when I lay in the white hospital room and understood, completely and without any remaining ambiguity, what Raymond had intended to do. That time had passed. What remained was simply the doing. I want to come, she said. I know it's not my place. It is your place, I said. You are the reason I moved when I did and not later. You deserve to be there. She was quiet for a moment. Dad's not going to like that. No, I said. He's not. Will you tell him ahead of time that I'm coming? I considered it. No, I said. I'll introduce it as a given. As something that has already been decided and doesn't require his input. Lily looked at me with those clear eyes. You've been doing this your whole life, haven't you? She said. Making decisions that people don't realize have already been made. I thought about 43 years of quiet, careful work. About Eleanor Callaway Holdings and the 7 properties and the investment portfolio and the foundation in Gerald's name and all the long, patient, invisible architecture of a life built by a woman who had understood from the beginning that the most powerful position was the one where no one thought to look. Yes, I said. I have. Catherine Paulides had a conference room on the 4th floor of a building downtown that looked, from the outside, like the kind of building where nothing particularly consequential ever happened. Brick, modest, well-maintained. Inside, the conference room was long and bright with a table that seated 12 and windows that looked out over the street and bookshelves along one wall filled with the dense, specific literature of the law. I arrived first. Catherine was already there, along with Stephen and Grace. We greeted each other with the ease of people who have done difficult work together and trust each other completely. Grace had the files organized on the table before her, a comprehensive arrangement, precise and ordered. I had reviewed everything with her the previous week. There would be no surprises for me in those files. The surprises, this morning, belonged to someone else. Raymond arrived 7 minutes after me, which was 4 minutes early. He was wearing a jacket, which he had not worn to dinner, which told me he had understood, on some level, that this was a different kind of meeting. He had his own folder with him, the same one, I suspected, or a descendant of it, updated and reorganized after the hospital plan had failed to produce results. He looked around the room when he came in, noting Catherine, noting Stephen, noting Grace, and then noting Lily beside me and stopping for a fraction of a second before continuing to his chair. Lily, he said. Hi, Dad, she said. Calm. Steady. My mother's eyes. I didn't realize you'd be joining us. Grandma asked me to come, she said. I wanted to be here. He looked at me. I met his gaze with the particular expression I had been practicing, without intending to practice it, for the better part of 2 years, attentive, warm, entirely unreadable. Of course, he said, and sat down. Brenda had not come. Raymond had not suggested she come, and I had not asked. That, too, was a decision. What was going to happen in this room was between me and my son, and I wanted Brenda outside of it, at least initially, for reasons that had to do with the particular dynamic between us and the fact that what I needed Raymond to understand, he could only understand alone. Catherine opened the meeting with the calm efficiency that was her signature. She thanked Raymond for coming. She explained, briefly, the purpose of the meeting, to review the current structure of my estate documents and financial arrangements, to ensure that Raymond had accurate and complete information, and to discuss any questions or concerns he might have. She said this without inflection, the way a very good lawyer says things when the thing being said is entirely true but also contains within it the shape of something the other person is not yet aware of. Raymond nodded. He had his folder on the table in front of him. His hands were resting on it in a way that was almost casual and not quite. I appreciate the opportunity, he said, and he meant it, I could tell. He believed this meeting was his opportunity. The moment he had been working toward. He would hear the full picture, finally, and then the conversation about consolidation and power of attorney and simplification could proceed on the basis of real information, and everything would become available to him in the orderly, manageable way he had been planning for. He was correct that the full picture was coming. He was incorrect about almost everything else. Catherine began with the existing documents he knew about, the joint savings account, now restructured as a single-name account in my name only with a designated beneficiary arrangement that required a clear legal process for any changes. She explained this calmly. Raymond's expression shifted slightly but he said nothing. She moved to the house. She explained the trust structure, the terms, the trustee arrangements, the remainder beneficiary provisions. She placed a copy of the relevant pages on the table in front of Raymond and gave him a moment to read them. I watched him read. I watched the moment he reached the conditional provisions, the behavioral conditions I had written into the document 16 years ago, conditions which specified, in precise legal language, the circumstances under which a remainder beneficiary would and would not receive the property. He looked up. These conditions, he said carefully. When were these added? They were part of the original trust document, Catherine said. Established in 2003. A pause. I wasn't aware of these provisions. No, Catherine said. You weren't. He set the pages down. He was working very hard at keeping his expression neutral, and he was mostly succeeding, and I noticed the effort and felt something that was not quite sympathy and not quite its opposite but something in between. The complicated feeling of watching someone you love understand that the map they have been using is wrong. What do the conditions refer to specifically? He asked. Catherine looked at me. I nodded. They refer, Catherine said, to a range of behaviors that would constitute a failure of the standard of care and respect owed to the primary beneficiary, to Eleanor, during her lifetime. Including, but not limited to, unauthorized attempts to access or transfer financial assets, misrepresentation of legal documents, or attempts to obtain legal authority over Eleanor's affairs through means that do not have her fully informed consent. The room was very quiet. Raymond's hands were still on top of his folder. I see, he said. There are also provisions, Catherine continued, relating to what happens to the remainder interest in the property if the conditional provisions are triggered. What happens? Catherine placed another document on the table. The property transfers, under those circumstances, to a trust established for the benefit of Lily Marsh, to be administered by Eleanor during her lifetime and by the trustee named in the document after Eleanor's death. Raymond looked at Lily. She looked back at him with her direct clear gaze and said nothing. He looked back at Catherine. And you're telling me this now because Eleanor wants you to have accurate information, Catherine said. Which is the purpose of this meeting. And because, I said, it was the first time I had spoken directly, and Raymond turned to me with the speed of someone who has been waiting to look at me, needing to look at me, not sure what he will find. There are some other things you should know as well. Grace opened the second file. I watched my son's face as Catherine walked him through it. I watched it the way I had watched important things my whole life, without expression, without comment, with the whole of my attention. The LLC. The 7 properties. The Delaware registration. The 43 years of accumulated rental income and the current valuation, which Catherine delivered in the same level tone she used for everything, as a fact that existed in the world and needed to be communicated. Raymond was very still. The investment portfolio. The brokerage account in the name Eleanor Calloway. The decades of disciplined, patient, compounding growth that had been sitting in accounts my son had never thought to look for because he had been looking for Eleanor Marsh's financial life and had not known there was another name to search. Still very still. The foundation. Gerald's name on the masthead. The endowment and the scholarship programs and the young people in Gerald's home county who were attending university because a woman they would never meet had decided, 16 years ago, that money could be used for something lasting. Raymond closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he opened them, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and between us was everything that had not been said for 2 years and everything that had been said too carefully and everything that was now, finally, visible. How long, he said. His voice was steady. I gave him credit for that. The first account opened in 1979, I said. The LLC the same year. Most of the properties were acquired over the following 2 decades. The investment portfolio has been running since 1983. Before you married Dad. Some of it, yes. Some of it after. Your father knew the general shape of things. Not every detail, but enough. He never told me. He trusted my judgment about what to tell and when to tell it, I said. We agreed on that a long time ago. Raymond looked down at the table. He looked at the documents spread before him, Catherine's neat, comprehensive documentation of the life he had not known his mother was living. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Grace shifted slightly in her chair and Stephen made a small note on his pad, and Lily, beside me, did not move at all. Then Raymond said something I had not quite expected. "Mom," he said. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "What I was trying to do," he said, and then stopped. Started again. "The documents at the hospital. The power of attorney. I told myself it was about protecting you. About making things easier. And maybe another stop, maybe I believed that, partly. But I also," he pressed his lips together. "I also wanted to know that things were secure. That there was going to be enough. For me. For Brenda." He looked up. "That's not the same thing as protecting you. I know that." The room was very quiet. I looked at my son. I looked at the boy who had been, once, small enough to fit in my arms, who had learned to read at the kitchen table I still owned, who had cried at his father's funeral with a grief so genuine and so lost that it had broken something in me to see it. I looked at the man he had become, who had spent 2 years building a careful plan around a version of his mother that was a corner of a canvas, a fraction of a whole, a map of a territory he had never actually visited. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "Are you going to," he began, and then stopped, as if the question were too large to finish. "Enforce the conditional provisions?" I said. "Yes." I had thought about this. I had thought about it with the same careful patience I had applied to every decision of consequence in my life, taking it apart and examining each piece and putting it back together until I understood what I actually believed, separate from what anger or hurt or wounded pride might tell me I should believe. "Not immediately," I said. "And not as punishment. What I am going to do is establish, clearly and in writing, that those provisions exist and that I am aware of them and that I intend to remain the person who determines whether they are triggered." I paused. "That means we are going to have a different relationship going forward than the one you had planned for. You are not going to manage my finances. You are not going to have authority over my decisions. You are going to be my son, which is what you actually are, and which is, if you are willing to accept what that actually means, still something worth being." Raymond was looking at his hands. He was a man who needed a moment, and I gave it to him. The room was patient. "And Lily," he said finally. "What about her?" He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him, steady and clear, the way she had always been. "I've been a poor father to her," he said. "In the ways that I didn't see. The ways that were about making her manageable instead of," he stopped. "I should have been doing with her what you did with me. Showing up. Actually showing up, not just being present in the room." Lily said nothing. But something in her face changed very slightly, in the direction of something softer than what had been there before. "That," I said quietly, "is between you and her. That is the conversation that matters most, and it is not mine to have for you." Raymond nodded. He looked back at the documents on the table, the whole picture, laid out before him at last. "This is," he said, and then made a sound that was almost a laugh, not a happy laugh, but the kind that arrives when a person encounters something so much larger than their frame for it that the only response available is a kind of stunned acknowledgement. "This is not what I expected." "No," I said. "I imagine it isn't." "What happens now?" "Now," I said, "you go home and speak to Brenda. You tell her the actual situation, which is that my financial life is not available to be consolidated, that the house is in a trust with conditions you would be very unwise to test, and that our relationship going forward needs to be built on what is actually true rather than on what you hoped would be true." I paused. "And you think carefully about what kind of son you want to be? Because that question is still open. It doesn't have to be answered by what happened in the last 2 years. But it does have to be answered." Raymond was quiet for a long time. Then he stood. He picked up his folder, the one with the documents he had brought, the ones that were now entirely beside the point, and he held it for a moment, and then he set it back down on the table. He left it there. "I'll call you this week," he said to me. "I'll be here," I said. He looked at Lily. She looked at him. Something passed between them, not resolution, not yet, but the possibility of it. The acknowledgement that there was something between them worth salvaging if they were both willing to do the work. Lily, he said. Can we, sometime? Can we talk? Yes, she said simply. We can talk. He nodded. He thanked Catherine. He walked out. The door closed behind him, and the room held its quiet for a moment, and then Grace gathered the files with her efficient hands and Stephen made a final note, and Catherine looked at me with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things and found, in this particular thing, something she considered just. Eleanor, she said, are you all right? Yes, I said. And I was. Not in the uncomplicated way of someone who has won something and is enjoying the winning, but in the deeper, quieter way of someone who has done what they set out to do and can now rest in the knowledge that it was the right thing, done in the right way, at the right time. Grandma, Lily said, and her voice was the voice of the 7-year-old who had told me I wasn't complicated, I was just me, and she took my hand the way she had taken it in Dr. Osei's office, with the careful steadiness of someone who is concentrating very hard on holding something that matters. I squeezed it once. She squeezed back. I want to tell you where things are now, because that is the part of the story that matters most, and I have found that people who tell these stories sometimes stop at the revelation and do not tell you what comes after, as if the after were less interesting than the confrontation. It is not. It is, in many ways, the only part that counts. Raymond called the following Thursday. The conversation was short and careful on both sides, the conversation of two people who are learning to speak to each other in a new register. He told me that he had spoken to Brenda. He told me that she was upset, which I had expected, and that she was reconsidering some things, which I had not expected but which I received with something that was perhaps generosity and perhaps simply realism. People are capable of reconsidering things, if they are given genuine cause to do so. He told me that he was sorry. He said it plainly, without the careful language of someone who has been advised by a lawyer, which meant it was as close to sincere as Raymond had yet come in our conversations, and I accepted it in the spirit it was offered, which is to say not as resolution but as a beginning. I told him I was not interested in punishment. I was interested in honesty. I was interested in a relationship built on what was actually true, and if he was interested in that too, there was still time to build it. He said he was. I believed him, partially. Partial belief seemed, at this stage, appropriate. Brenda sent a card 3 weeks later. Handwritten, brief, not entirely comfortable in its construction, the words of someone who is not used to apology and is trying to learn the vocabulary of it. I put it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for several days and then filed it in the drawer where I keep things I am not ready to discard but am not ready to celebrate. That felt honest. Patricia Chen, the nurse who had pressed a folded note into my palm in a hospital corridor on a gray March morning, became, in the months after the surgery, someone I thought about often. I did not know how to find her, hospital privacy considerations made direct inquiry complicated, and for some time I let the thought of her remain as a kind of private gratitude, the kind you carry without being able to discharge. Then, in September, I attended a fundraising event for the hospital's nursing education program, the kind of event I had begun attending more deliberately in the years since Gerald died, the kind that reminded me that money, handled carefully and aimed at something real, could become something lasting. And at that event, across a crowded reception room, I saw a small woman with precise posture in nursing scrubs with a name badge that I crossed the room to read. Patricia Chen. She looked at me when I appeared beside her and I could see in her expression the particular recognition of someone who has done something significant and hopes it was received the way it was intended. I thought about you, she said. After your surgery. I hoped you were all right. I was more than all right, I said. Because of what you did. She shook her head slightly, the way modest people do when they have done something brave. I just wrote down what I saw. You decided to act on what you saw, I said. That is the harder thing. The seeing is not enough without the acting, and most people with the seeing never get to the acting. She looked at me steadily. Did it help? Yes, I said. It helped more than you know. I told her a small portion of what had happened, not the financial specifics, which were private, but the shape of it, enough that she could understand that the note had landed in the hands of someone who had known what to do with it. She listened with the complete attention of a very good nurse, and at the end she said nothing, just nodded once in the way of a person for whom the confirmation is sufficient. We exchanged information. I told her I was on the hospital foundation board and that there was a nursing education scholarship I had recently endowed, and she looked at me with an expression that was part surprise and part the particular recognition that arrives when you understand you have been in the presence of something larger than it appeared. For nurses, she said. For anyone in healthcare training who needs it, I said. But I had nurses in mind particularly. The ones who notice things. The ones who act on what they notice. She shook my hand at the end of the evening with a firmness that said more than words. I drove home along streets that were beginning to turn with the first colors of fall, and I felt the particular quality of an evening that has added something permanent to the world, the feeling of a door opened in a direction that will not close. The foundation, Gerald's foundation, the one I had been building for 16 years, announced its first major initiative in October, a vocational scholarship program endowed in Gerald Marsh's name, in the city where he had grown up, for students pursuing trades and technical certifications. The announcement was small, local, the kind of news that matters intensely to the people it affects and not at all to anyone else. I attended the ceremony in a church hall that smelled of old wood and good coffee, and I sat in a folding chair in the third row and watched the first 4 scholarship recipients, young men and women with the particular combination of capability and uncertainty that belongs to people who are on the edge of something that will change their lives, receive their awards. Gerald would have wept. He was a man who wept at things that deserved weeping at, without embarrassment, without the masculine inhibition that I had always found a waste of a perfectly good emotional capacity. He would have sat beside me in that folding chair and wept and not cared who saw it, and I sat alone and held the feeling of what he would have done inside me like something precious. I did not weep. I had done my weeping, over the years, in the appropriate private moments. What I felt in that church hall was something quieter and more permanent, the feeling of a thing rightly done, of money that had been patient long enough to become something other than money. That is what I have always believed, in the end, about the careful management of resources. The point is not the accumulation. The accumulation is only the waiting, the patient holding of possibility until possibility becomes something real. The point is what you build. The point is what lasts. Gerald built furniture. He built chairs and tables and small cabinets with clean lines and solid joints that would last longer than the people who bought them. He worked with his hands because he loved the particular satisfaction of making something that held weight, that could be trusted, that did what it was supposed to do quietly and without complaint for as long as it was needed. I built differently. With numbers instead of wood, with accounts instead of joints. But the principle was the same. The principle has always been the same. Lily came for Thanksgiving. She came with her mother, Raymond's ex-wife, a sensible woman named Diane who had remained, through the years of Raymond and Brenda and all the various complications, someone I considered genuinely good, someone whose clear eyes I recognized in her daughter. Diane brought a sweet potato casserole and very good wine and the easy warmth of a person who is comfortable in their own skin. Raymond came as well. He arrived separately from Lily and Diane, which was a logistical reflection of the current state of things, carefully, with awareness of the distances that still needed to be navigated. Brenda did not come. Raymond said she had family in Ohio. I accepted this without comment. There would be a time for Brenda and me to find whatever accommodation was available to us, and this was not yet that time. The dinner was not entirely comfortable. There were moments that required careful navigation, topics that were not yet available, silences that contained too much, the particular awkwardness of people who are trying to rebuild something at a dinner table, which is perhaps not the ideal venue but is the one most consistently available. But there were also other moments. Raymond helped Lily set the table and they talked while they did it, not about anything important, just the ordinary talk of a father and daughter who are relearning how to be in the same room. I watched from the kitchen door. It was not resolution. Resolution takes time and it takes work and it takes the willingness to keep going back to the conversation even when the conversation is hard. They were at the beginning of that, both of them, and the beginning is the most uncertain part, the part where you cannot yet tell whether the thing you are building is going to hold. But they were trying. That was the thing that mattered. After dinner, when Diane was helping with the dishes and Raymond had stepped outside for air, Lily sat beside me in the living room where Gerald's reading chair still stood beside the lamp, and she said, "Grandma. Are you happy?" I thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. I am myself, I said finally. Which is not the same as happy, exactly, but is the thing that makes happiness possible. I know who I am. I know what I have built. I know what I want the rest of it to look like. I paused. That is a kind of peace that I think some people never find. And I am grateful for it. Lily nodded slowly. I want to be like that, she said. When I'm older. I want to know what I've built. You already know what you're building, I said. You've been building it for years. You just can't see it yet because you're still in the middle of the construction. She looked at me. What am I building? Clarity, I said. The capacity to see what is actually there, not what people want you to see. And the willingness to act on what you see. I paused. That is the most useful thing a person can build. Everything else follows from it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at Gerald's chair, the worn fabric of the armrests, the lamp beside it that I still turned on in the evenings. I miss Grandpa, she said. So do I said. Every single day. Do you think he knew? About all of it? About what you'd built? He knew the shape of it, I said. He knew enough. He trusted the rest. That's a lot of trust. It was a lot of trust, I agreed. And he was right to have it. I hope I was right to deserve it. You were, she said simply, without hesitation, the way she said things she was certain of. I looked at this girl who had her grandfather's eyes and my mother's steadiness and something that was entirely her own, something I did not yet have a name for but recognized as the particular quality of a person who is going to be, in whatever form her life takes, entirely, completely, remarkably herself. Yes, I said. I think I was. I want to tell you one last thing, because it is the thing that is hardest to say and the thing that matters most. I do not tell this story as a story about victory. I do not tell it as a story about wealth or power or the satisfaction of having more than people believed you had. Those things are real, and I will not pretend they are not part of it. The capacity to protect yourself requires resources, and I had them, and they mattered. But the thing that mattered more, the thing that made everything else possible, was not the money. It was the watching. It was the 43 years of paying attention to what was actually true, as distinct from what was convenient to believe. It was the discipline of remaining myself, Eleanor Calloway, Eleanor Marsh, Eleanor in her garden and Eleanor at her kitchen table and Eleanor in the hospital corridor with a folded note pressed into her palm, through everything that tried to make me into something smaller, something more manageable. Something that could be organized into a shape someone else had chosen. I am not that woman. I was never that woman. The woman I am is 71 years old and recovering from cardiac surgery and sitting in her garden on an October morning while the lavender blooms and the roses open their last flowers of the season. She has a son she is learning to be honest with, a granddaughter she loves without reservation, a foundation that will outlast her, and 7 properties in 3 states that generate income for causes she has chosen herself. She has an attorney she trusts completely and a nurse she met in a corridor who reminded her that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is write down what they see and put it in someone's hand and trust them to do something useful with it. She has a fireproof box under the folders in her closet with a letter in it to Catherine Paulides, still sealed, still waiting, containing instructions for the shape of things after she is gone. She is not afraid of what comes after. She has spent a lifetime building something that does not require her presence to continue. That is what good building looks like. That is what Gerald meant when he said a house should feel safe before it looks fancy. The safety is built in. The safety is in the structure itself, patient and invisible and holding everything up. I tend my garden. I answer Lily's messages, which come daily now, small and vivid and full of the particular life of someone who is in the middle of becoming what they will be. I make coffee in the morning and sit in Gerald's chair in the evenings with a book. I attend the hospital foundation meetings and the scholarship ceremonies and the small, specific events at which the money I manage becomes the thing it was always becoming. And some mornings I stand in the garden and look at the lavender I planted along the back fence, and I think about a woman 24 years old opening her first account with $40 and the particular faith that takes, not optimism, not ambition, but the faith of someone who believes, without yet having any evidence, that the patient invisible work of a life carefully built will, in the fullness of time, become visible. It does. It becomes visible. You just have to be willing to wait for it, to tend it, to protect it from the people who mistake its quietness for absence, who mistake your patience for weakness, who look at the corner of the canvas and conclude they have seen the whole painting. They have not seen the whole painting. They never do. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who share it. If this one moved you, the next video on your screen is waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There's always another woman the world underestimated. And we tell those stories here.